Welcome. Nice to see you again. Gluttons for punishment. We're moving to the third session. The first session we discussed the form of love which we called Ahavas Olam, which was a love that requires a very high degree of contemplation and meditation to create within us from scratch. We also mentioned in passing that the Alter Rebbe notes that there is also a form of love which is so absolutely out of this world that it only comes as a gift from above. But you first had to get to the first level of Ahavas Olam before you get the Ahavas Rabbah, and that is a gift from above. But both of those are dependent on real work within. The next session, and we spoke about interpersonal love and love beyond in the abstract. Then we spoke about the nature of desire. And we said the nature of ta'ava, or desire, is almost an opposite tendency in terms of love, because whereas love is an experience in the present moment, you experience a state of love. When it comes to desire, you're experiencing the absence or the distance of the object of love. That's why you desire it, because it's not being experienced at this very moment. So you can desire a loved one who's away overseas. You can desire an experience that you might have had and want to recreate it. Again, we said, however, that desire can be modulated through the higher self or the lower self, the Nefesh Elokis or the Nefesh Bahamis. If it's modulated through the lower self, then the desire is not a pure expression of potential love, but it's a need for the ego of self. And if it becomes unhealthily entrenched, it can move way across to even being an addiction, where your control over the expression of that need is no longer there. So we spoke about a higher order desire, which is an altruistic desire, and we spoke about baser aspects of desire. Today we're going to go into something even, I won't say more profound, but perhaps more in a way that you and I can relate to it in a very, very childlike manner. And that is filial love. The nature of a love between, for example, parent and child, between brother and sister, but it can extend far beyond that, certainly to a spouse, even to a very good friend. The prototype absolute love of friendship is the love of Jonathan with David HaMelech, King David. King David and Jonathan is the prototype of what is the most intense love, brotherly love without being brothers as such, and of course sisterly love at the same time. When we speak in terms of this love, the Alter Rebbe says there is a real distinctive feature of this love that doesn't exist to the same extent in the ones we've been speaking about, and that is self-sacrifice. The capacity of someone to love someone else to such an extent that they're prepared to give up their life for another. Let's look at that. We have to consider that more deeply. Because when we're talking in terms of giving up one's life, it is negating life, whereas the loves that we've been speaking about in the first two sessions are the opposite of negation of life. It's the affirmation of love. All of those were the experience of love, or the desire for having the experience of love. And now we're talking about a love that surpasses itself, that even negates its very existence, so that I would give up my life for my father or for my mother, for example, etc. So it is a variation to the point of its self-negation. And we have to ask ourselves, where is that coming from? What is the nature of that experience within that will facilitate it? Under what circumstances? Why might it occur in one filial family setting, whereas not in another? What is the nature of the bond that creates that degree of kinship that one is prepared to expire for the sake of another one? We just read about something recently in the Australian newspapers here. It was the instance where one of the SAS soldiers, this was just last week I think, died in Afghanistan, leading his troops, and he was as a leader, always at the forefront. He was shot. My question is, what is it? What was the nature of his activity that allowed him to be at the front, taking the bullets as a sacrificial lamb, so to speak, to protect his soldiers in the rear? Which is very, very common in the Israeli army, because always the officer's cry is "Acharai," follow me. The Israeli officer is always in the front. What is it? Is it the same kind of phenomenon that I'm speaking about in terms of family love?
It's more of a duty.
So there is a distinctive feature, even though it's the preparedness to give up of one's life, but it relates, interestingly, what do we mean by duty? You said a good word. What's another word? Responsibility. What is it about duty and what is duty and responsibility? What is it that a person can be so committed to duty and responsibility, even to the extent of being to put their life on the line? What is that?
Is that really love?
That's the question I'm raising, because I want to distinguish it. Is it an instance of love at all?
It's taking on a particular role.
It's taking on a role. What's your relationship to that role that creates that strength of commitment and conviction to that very degree?
It's more about the ego.
It could be more about the ego, meaning I have a reputation, I am an officer, etc., etc. It might be, if you didn't want to put it into egocentric terms, let's see if we can switch it around into a positive characterization. What might be the nature of that expression? Idealism, which means what's
Altruism.
altruism, but that means what in terms of a relationship? It means...
Like outwardness.
Yes, it's a commitment to a cause. It is a relationship, but the relationship may not be a person. It may be a belief. It may be a commitment. It could be something much more abstract. It may be something more profound. It may be a relationship to a person. I, as officer, in my duty to my soldiers, to those under my command. So it may be, but it's not because you love. You may actually dislike actively some members of your who happen to be in your command, which I understand is often the case. My son, who is an officer in tanks in Shirion in Israel, actually dislikes actively one of his officers, who's even superior to him. So, but there's a relationship. And each would be in front of their soldiers for the sake of each other even. But you said correctly, that may not be anything to do with the love the way we're talking about. And it may have to do with ego, or it may be the altruistic commitment to a cause. And under those circumstances, that may be a very positive feature. But that's not love. So what's the love that we're talking about? When we talk about parent-child, for example, child prepared to give their life for the parent or vice versa, which was, unfortunately, often the case during the Holocaust. We all know of stories and incidents that we've read about where it was quite overt and open. What is that commitment? What is that love? Different.
Love?
It's an unconditional love, but then all love, we said, should be unconditional to be true love per se. It's not dependent on self, so we still need a further distinguishing feature. And this is the point that the Alter Rebbe is drawing out and indicating that this is yet a different form of love. He's moving systematically through chapters 44, 45, 46 and onwards, and noting things that you and I in English would call examples of love, and noting the subtleties which become really major differentials. It's not as if that one's blurring with the other. They're quite different. And the Alter Rebbe says, this is yet a different form of love. It's coming from yet a much more profound place. It's a place that we have genetically inherited, yet from one of our forefathers or great ones. I'm going to speak about archetypes and this notion of spiritual genetic transmission, which I've mentioned in past weeks, next week in much more detail as such. So, we have this kind of emanation, which we have within us, and in fact this one, which we're speaking about tonight, emanates from Moshe Rabbeinu, from Moses. As I said, the dynamic we're going to speak about in our next session. But there's a quality that each one of us has as a spiritual genetic influence of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses as such. So we all possess it.
The Jewish people.
Yes. So the descendants of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, which Moshe Rabbeinu obviously was. And we are as a consequence. But the point being here that when we say in terms of being able to express it and reflect an emanation, I use the word emanation and reflection quite deliberately. Whereas the first loves that we spoke about in the previous weeks are ones which we create, in a sense, within. Although we have been given the possibility to do so through Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, but we have to create it. We have to dig deeper. This one, which we're talking about filial love in this particular case, or familial love in this particular instance, is already there at the surface. And that's why it's so much more natural to love a parent, to love a brother, love a sister. It's, you would call instinctive because it's there. Okay? So we're going to notice later on that in terms of meditation, which we're going to speak about tonight, also in terms of how you draw the love out of self, in this particular instance, it doesn't take as much to draw it out because it's much more surface already, it's already much more there, whereas to create a new love, as we'll see a bit later on, that is somewhat more difficult. Now, the question is, how do you arouse these things? How do you arouse emotions? You remember that we may have learnt once upon a time the interesting incongruity in saying the Shema. If you look at the Shema and the translation, we say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We don't have to worry too much about the translation except the first word. Shema, listen, hear. And then it goes on, Ve'ahavta, and you must love God. The question which is raised by the Rebbeim is, come on, how can you command feelings? Can I order you to love? Can I simply say, Ve'ahavta, do it? You can't order feelings. It's not like a menu at a restaurant. You just can't order feelings. So what's the Shema saying to us? You must. You can't. I can order you to think about something, but I can't really order you to feel about something. So obviously somewhere we've got a mismatch. So the way it's explained is, in Chassidus, the Shema is a precondition to a true Ve'ahavta. The Shema of contemplation and meditation becomes the precursor to a true loving. It's not I order you to love, it's a consequence. Ve'ahavta is a consequence of Shema. Love is a consequence of deep meditative endeavor. Shema in this sense being not just listen with your ears, but it means listen with your heart, as they often say, but it means profound meditative endeavor. That's the deeper meaning of Shema. And then as a consequence, if you do that, then you will arouse within you the Ve'ahavta. It's not an instruction, it's not an order, it's a natural consequence. If I think about somebody I love, a friend, a parent, a sibling, and I think about their inner beauty, and I recognize their wonderful nature, and I spend 5 minutes just looking at all their virtues, what they've done with their life in terms of myself, etc., immediately I arouse a strong feeling. In other words, it's a consequence. So the idea of arousal as a consequence of mind activity is central to the Alter Rebbe's perception on how can you actually tame love, shape love, direct love, give it the capacity to be able to be directed in one direction which is emotionally intelligent as opposed to unintelligent. And that to Western person comes as a little bit of a jar. It's jarring because we have this a rather democratic notion that emotions are something which have truth in their own right and don't complicate it with mind and thought. I want to have pure emotion. Okay, you can have pure emotion. But you can have pure emotion, as we've said in previous weeks, and it's most unwise. Remember, you can love, 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 and in that very loving process, hurt, hurt, hurt. You can smother with love. You can bribe with love. You have to be intelligent with love. How do we actually create for ourselves the capacity of arousal one step beyond meditation? You've meditated, you've spent time, you've contemplated. I really love this person. She is so special to me. She is prepared to do this and this and this for me, and she always makes me feel good, always is empathic. Okay, I've got all that. And of course, the Alter Rebbe is expanding or extrapolating that into the person-God relationship. I'm using the human metaphoric relationship, but he's obviously directing us to a relationship like that with Hashem. But let's continue with the human metaphor. The next step is expression, voice. The use of sound, the use of voice in our Hasidic tradition is a very, very important tool of training the flow of emotion. So you can meditate, it can be inward, you can feel it, you can be highly aroused by it. But how do you actually manifest its truth? You have to say it. You have to go up to the person and actually express it. You have to have the courage to be able to open your mouth, take the breath, which is ongoing, and direct it through the 5 parts of the mouth, as we've said previously, the tongue, the lips, the throat, the palate, and the teeth. And that creates sound. And you've got to shape that sound according to the way that the mind allows sound to formulate syllables and words which are a container for the flow of self to reach another person. I can't reach you unless I speak to you or touch you. It's got to be outside of me. Voice is the first expression outside of me that can touch you. So when I speak to you, when you speak to me, forever I am not the same. And you are not the same, in the most subtle of ways. In the same way as a butterfly fluttering its wings in Los Angeles changes the weather patterns right here in Melbourne. Very subtly, but in fact does. Cause and effect is infinite. Likewise, my sound to your intelligibility in some shape or form. So voicing it creates the possibility of having this move from me to you. Let's look at this more closely. What is happening when I speak? What happens when you speak? You can breathe for 120 years. Doesn't require much effort. How long can you speak? Well, with some people, maybe too long. But nevertheless, there's a limit to speech, right? Either sleep overcomes you, or you run out of partners who are willing to listen to you, or whatever might be the case, all right? Yeah, okay. But you can't, your energy will deplete it because it takes more energy to speak than it does to think or to breathe, etc. Where's that energy coming from? That energy is coming from the neshama navigating its way through the obstacle course of the body, which it has many routes, or in America they say routes, to take in order to navigate that body. But through sound, it takes more effort. So if it takes more effort to speak, it means I have to draw more energy from the neshama in order to make it be. The more I have to draw from my inner self, the more it implants a pattern. And this is going to be a very, very important point on training of emotions. So the first level of being able to express and train emotions is to speak. That's why behavioralists, behavioral psychologists, will ask the person to do things or say things in order to create the thing within themselves. I can't love. I've lost the ability to love. Say I've got this problem. I go to my therapist and he spends time with me. If I go to the therapist that I personally would like, a behavioralist, what he will tell me is, Laibl, you know what? You can't love. I want you to begin with the outside and work in. How? I want you to make sure that you use the words, I love you, verbally, as often as possible to as many people as possible. Appropriately. I mean, you don't run around the whole street and, professional huggers or something like that, etc. Because by the very saying of it, you're creating the roadway. You're creating the keli. You're creating the possibility on the assumption that everyone possesses the capacity to love. That's an assumption we make in our tradition because that's part of the nature of a human being. Chesed and Gevurah. Chesed, we all have the capacity to share of ourselves. So based on that is we have to evoke the reality of it. And to evoke the reality of it, we have to create the pathway for it. So you say it. And then in appropriate circumstances, you actually mimic it in whatever it might be. What's the expression? Fake it until you make it, right? In a sense, that is true. In other words, by creating the pathway, you allow the truth to be able to become aroused and expressed as such. Then comes the next part. The next part is in terms of the mind and our capacity to be able to take it and internalize that pattern. So, let's do a little bit of physiology. We have a 3-brain system. We have the instinctive brain or the reptilian brain, right, which is more or less our survival instinct, as you pointed out before, something that's more instinctive per se. We have the brain responsible more for our emotions, and similarly the limbic system, and we have the mind-oriented part, which is the neocortex. Okay, so we have a 3-brain system. Somewhere along the line there's another part of that which is called the prefrontal cortex. Then the prefrontal cortex has the command, executive functions of the human being. Most everything that you do, most everything that you say and think actually is filtered through the prefrontal cortex as such. What happens in there? So in the last 20 years, ever since we've got scanning techniques, we have a better idea of the dynamics that take place within there. We know that when you say things over and over again, when you think things over and over again, you create what is called grooves of the mind, metaphorically. In other words, the neurotransmitters follow a pattern. So if I want to do that, right, you remember when you were taught to make one finger go like this, one finger this way? Can everyone do that? Have you learnt it as a child? Yes, okay. Or you remember when you did that? Right? Can everyone do that, please? It's great for the camera. Okay, excellent. Fine. So some people are doing this, and some people... Okay, and after a few minutes you get it. What? And you don't get it straight away. If you were like 3 years of age and I asked you to do that, she's getting it in the back. You're almost there. I can see you walking out of this room practicing this. But you don't get it straight away. But you do after a while. What's happened? Why beginning no and then yes? Because you're constantly refining the pattern of the neurotransmitters and their flow in the brain to be able to create that opportunity for yourself. The more you practice, the more the grooves of the mind set in. Likewise, as we said previously, to do with emotions. You want to create a loving repose, a loving expression, and you haven't got the capacity, or you haven't got the capacity for profundity in that respect, or whatever it might be the case, because all of us are learning through life how to deepen it more and more. It's not to say, you've got it. There's never, I've got there. There's infinite growth. There's no such thing as, that's the level you have to reach. No, I've got the Buddha within. No, not at all. You go beyond all the time. So the point being here is you refine it. How do you refine it? Repeating. Verbally, saying it over and over again, expressing it over and over again. And here comes the punchline. For chesed to flow as a default response in your social life, you have to lead a life of service. You know, the idea of leading a life of service has almost been hijacked by other traditions in a very nice way. You know, Buddhists learn a life of service. Sometimes, as I said, when I go to ashrams to speak there, and it's because there's such a high Jewish population, and they speak about life of service, I said, oh yeah, I get it, chesed. What's that? Okay, that's all right. They haven't been raised, they don't know. It's there. But when you lead a life of service, what does it really mean? It means the consciousness and awareness that everything I do is for a loving intent vis-a-vis the other. I serve you a drink because there is a degree of connection, and the more profound it is, the more loving it is. So it's not just serving the cup. Maybe it's how I actually choose what kind of a cup. Maybe it's how the tea is poured. Maybe it is the different way that I present it on the table. The more trouble I take to make you feel special in the way that I serve that cup. So there's degrees and degrees that you can lead and learn a life of service in order to be able to create greater and greater reposes of love. And what you're doing is reaffirming the neurotransmitting cycle within there, so it becomes more ingrained, so it becomes a default. So some people might say, but hold on, when it's a default, then it's mechanical, it's habitual. But I said it's infinite. What that habitual mechanical is, it tells you at first instance, be of service. But you can always grow in that service more and more and more. Be of service as opposed to be insecure and be stingy. Be of service instead of being egocentric and saying, I deserve, not they deserve. That's what the reaffirmation within the brain takes place. And that's why your consciousness flow will be one towards chesed and love, being the ahava, as we call it, the inner flow of chesed. That becomes the expression of love. Any further thoughts or questions on that part of our discussion?
Laibl, what you're talking about is visually shown very well in What the Bleep Do You Know, where they talk about the neurological pathways and how negative thought patterns just keep turning over and over and over because they're the patterns and the grooves in your mind. To go off the path is much harder, so you need to start saying it, and then the belief isn't actually there, but once you start saying it, then the belief comes as a result.
Yes, that's almost identical. It is identical. It's like a biofeedback loop. In other words, you begin knowing that this is what you should do and you believe it. Then by doing it, it reaffirms it within you, so it becomes easy for you to do the next step, and that consciousness becomes deeper and it comes back to you and onwards and onwards. And throughout a lifetime, it becomes more refined, more delicate, more empathic, more sympathetic. And that's what we try to achieve as human beings.
Just the word
Sorry.
The must love. I always translate it, either you shall or you will, as a concept. Shema Israel, be aware Israel, and as a concept, this awareness. Well, after you shall come.
Exactly. It's a natural consequence of it. Correct.
I just wanted to mention that talking about emotion and raising the energy, to me, one of the strongest experience was sitting and sharing a nigun, people sing Hasidic nigun, how the energy goes higher and how it catches you, the happiness. It just...
Absolutely.
You know, you can do it and repeat it and say, well, but it actually works.
Love is catchy. There's no question about it. Now, there's the other aspect, because we're talking here about familial love. Now, how do you move to that kind of position? Is that possibly trainable as such? So when we speak about of a life of service, and we're talking about serving people's needs, there are many ways of expressing it. It doesn't only express, God forbid, that you have to give up your life. That's, in a way, almost the nth degree. But you can sacrifice your time. You can sacrifice your effort. Someone comes in exactly the wrong moment in your life and needs a favor. You have absolutely the perfect excuse. And you know what? If you acted on your excuse, then you'd be completely excused. But what if you went one step further and despite your perfect excuse, you sacrificed that moment for them? That's what I'm talking about. And imagine the kind of consciousness or mindfulness that requires you to be able to do that. You're tired. You put in a hard day's work. It's 9:30. And someone rings you and says, oh, look, could you do me a favor? My car's broken down and I need you to come out and get me some leads. Now you can say quite well, I haven't got any leads for the battery. Because you haven't got any leads to fire up their battery. You've got to go, look, I'm really sorry. Call the RACV, call some, I can't do it. And that's perfectly okay. You don't have the leads. But what if you say, you know what? Yeah, I'll fix it for you. You haven't got the leads. And you take the trouble to make 10 phone calls to find somebody who's got leads to get that person out. That's going beyond the call of duty, but that is an expression of the degree of service and love that you can extend to somebody. I mean, we had a wonderful presentation the other evening by Lainey and Ayal on their experiences in the Nepal trekking. We were listening to that, and one of the things that struck me was when Ayal spoke about how they had from Pesach, because they were in Pesach in the biggest Seder in the whole world of over 800 people at the Seder. It wasn't like a little table like this of 25, 30, 40 people. That was a real table, okay? And it was up in Kathmandu, right? And that was, so some of the people said, because they knew they were trekking, take this box of matzahs with you, because you may need it on the way. So they take these box of matzahs, and as they travel around, or they don't travel, trek around, etc., like bees to honey, different Israelis say, matzah, can you spare it? Can I have a bit? Etc. There was no hesitation in Eyal's voice when he said, of course. Now, it's very likely and possible that because of that, they ran out of the matzah. And maybe their supplies were low. But the idea of sharing and giving unconditionally, because that's the default life of service. And when you go trekking in the Himalayas, go trekking in Nepal, etc., there's a certain camaraderie that I sense amongst all trekkers where you do go out of your way to help each other. Halavai that this should take place in the nice urban communities that we live in so comfortably in New Jersey and Melbourne, Australia, okay? And that's what we're talking about, to create that default life of service as such. So when we're talking in terms of familial love, there's always the Yetzer Hara, the part of the Nefesh Bahamis that will always be able to give you an excuse. I'm too tired now. It's not fair. They can't keep calling on my time. They can't keep calling on my service. In fact, it's probably very good for them to try to fend for themselves for a change. I mean, I'm actually helping them by saying no, aren't I? And there's many ways that the Nefesh Bahamis gets stuck into you, and the Yetzer Hara, by the way, the difference between the words Yetzer Hara and Nefesh Bahamis. Some people ask me and I haven't responded. Nefesh Bahamis is the spiritual capacity to be able to be concerned with self. The Yetzer Hara is the emotional extension of that solely serves self. Okay? So one is a spiritual precursor, and the other one is the conscious emotional expression. So Yetzer is when it really comes out into the world, that's not good. Nefesh Bahamis is inside, but it has the capacity for our emotions to flow negatively. Okay? I don't want to help you. Right now I'm tired. I'm in the middle of the Collingwood-Carlton match next week, and I am not going to be disturbed under any circumstances, etc., etc. Okay? That's what we're talking about. The Mesiras Nefesh we're talking about. Mesirat Nefesh, the giving over of one's life. But life doesn't have to be only literal. It can be the quality of one's life in that moment. What I want to do at this moment, where I want to be at this moment, I give that away. I give that over. Understood?
You say the Nefesh and Bahamis gives you the locomotive power, the ability to move physically?
Everything physical comes in Nefesh Bahamis. So there are things in Nefesh Bahamis that are obviously neutral and if positive. If it weren't for the Nefesh Bahamis, you wouldn't be able to have the instinctive drive to survive. You wouldn't be keen to eat food. You wouldn't want to be involved with physicality. Nefesh Bahamis allows us to have a contact point with the world of physical reality. So that is an essential service. What I said last week was that the Nefesh Bahamis, however, never knows where to stop. In other words, I want, but I want more, I want more, I want more. And therefore, that's when the Yetzer comes in and tries to carry out the more. I'm just going to have a little spoonful of the ice cream. And it won't hurt me to have another spoonful. So I finish one tub, I've got another tub in the fridge. That's how the Yetzer operates through the Nefesh Bahamis. One spoonful doesn't hurt anybody, even 5 spoonfuls probably doesn't hurt anybody. But when it becomes addictive, then it hurts very, very badly. Okay, when it's called emotional eating, then it's something that's unintelligible in terms of the mind. It's not intelligent any longer. So the Nefesh Elokis, the higher self, comes and says, Nefesh Bahamis, Ad Kan, here and no more.
So did you define spiritual capacity for this? I didn't understand how you defined
the spiritual capacity to be self-centered, Nefesh Bahamis, the spiritual capacity to be other-centered, servant leadership, life of service, Nefesh Elokis. Each has its emotional, emotional servant. The emotional servant of Nefesh Bahamis is Yetzer Hara, and the emotional servant of the positive, the higher order self, is the Yetzer HaTov. Okay. Now, in context of all this, we have to ask ourselves, let's go back to meditation now, because that holds the key to everything. And when I use the word meditation, I'm not talking about some of the contemporary notions of meditation that requires you to adopt a certain posture, and you have to empty your mind, and you have to be I'm not talking about that. Because meditation means many things in many different circles in terms of many different spiritual pathways. There's no such thing as the right definition of meditation, the right way to meditate. There's no such thing. Meditation means focusing. And what you focus on, why you focus, how you focus, that depends on your spiritual tradition or on your cultural pathway. And there's many, many different ways. And there is a Jewish cultural pathway, or in our instance, a spiritual set of teachings that explains a functionality of what hisbonenus is, what the idea is of being reflexive with mind, hitbonen, as opposed to bina. In other words, it's self-oriented, lehitbonen, to allow it to flow through you. So when we use meditative capacities, we've said earlier in this session, you have to evoke a much deeper capacity of meditative focus in order to draw out Ahavas Olam and Ahavas Rabbah, the ones we spoke about in the first session, because they need to be created. When I say created, we have a spiritual genetic inheritance, but that's all latent. It's latent in a way that's deeply embedded. You have to create the consciousness of it. Okay, and there are certain meditative activities that have to take place in terms of that. I said that when we're talking about the love that we're talking about right now, that particular love which we call familial love, which is in the Aramaic, kabar dishtadel basar avoy ve'ime drachim lo yosib agam nafshe ruche, a person who, this is Aramaic, a son or a daughter who loves their parent to such an extent that they're prepared to give up of their self-existence, even up to that point of giving up their life. How do you create what meditative activity? Meditation can fall into two kinds of categories in Judaism. You can have the fire meditation and you can have the water meditation. And it's not as obvious as it sounds when we say fire and water meditation. First, let me introduce this discussion with the following. In our mechanisms of personality analysis through Kabbalah and Hasidus, especially with Chabad, we use the four elements of Kabbalah, fire, air, earth, and water, as a beginning point of analysis of what the nature of an individual might be about. Some people around this table are dominated by a fire personality, some by a water personality, earth personality, etc. Okay, and we can, or this is not a class on that, that'd be nice to explore also, but we can intuitively almost guess what that's about. What might be the personality traits or the exhibited behaviors of a fire-oriented personality? Share with me. What do you expect? Enthusiasm, passion, higher order, but real... Fiery, temperamental. This is one of the most positive audiences because mostly when I ask that question we get all the negatives. Anger, jealousy, okay. They're also part of the fire. Yeah. In other words, whether you direct it through the higher order self or the lower order self will determine whether your fiery innate nature is a positive asset or a negative deficit. And that's part of consciousness, and that's part of wisdom, and it's part of learning, and it's part of training. So that's what a fire-oriented personality. That's not to say that you don't possess all the other three at the same time. Everyone has all four, but some of us are dominated predominantly by fire orientation, and water might be a subdominant, and air might be a sub-subdominant, and earth might be a sub-sub-subdominant. Okay, so you can see you can have this kind of an analytical model that you can utilize as such. What might be an earth-oriented personality? What might be the traits of an earth-oriented personality? Grounded. Practical. Deep. Let's go to some negatives. I know that we're a positive audience, but think of some other people. Negatives. Stubborn could be. inertia. The most traditional negative ones are laziness and depression, as the Alter Rebbe points out in Sefer Tanya. That also comes from earth personalities. People who tend to be earth personalities can have, if this is channeled in the lower orders of Nefesh Bahamis, it can come out disastrously in terms of laziness and depression and things like that. If it comes out positively, it comes out as grounded, reality, and all the positive virtues that we've mentioned. And anyone who's an earth-oriented personality has the capacity to be able to channel it one way or the other way. Okay. Having said that, let's apply some of that in terms of meditation now and ask ourselves, in context of the love facility which we possess, what kind of meditative activity might be conducive to be able to elicit this kind of loving repose. So when we speak in terms of meditations for the purpose of being able to connect to things that are missing, let's go back to last week's discussion of ta'ava, desire. When we are in a state of desire and we want to move that desire into positivity, then which one of the four elements would be most appropriately related to how you and I consider ta'ava or desire? Fire. Right? Even if you don't go through the logic of it, you can almost grasp it. The fire relates more intimately to states of desire and wanting. In the same way, because Hasidus explains what's the nature of fire. When you watch a fire, it's constantly reaching up, grasping up. It reaches up and then withdraws. The ebb and flow, the ratzu vashuv, which is characteristic of all things of existence. Everything moves constantly in this tidal fashion of ebb and flow. But fire, in terms of up and down, on another occasion we'll understand that, because there's a fire source in the upper regions which the lower fire is trying to reach and touch. But because the nature of fire on this earth has to be that it's grounded, it belongs to the earth, it has to come down. So fire flickers constantly, upwards and downwards, etc., trying to do that. So that is more in terms of being able to regulate and develop the correctness of the flow of desire. You would use certain fire-based meditative foci at such instances to be able to correct it and to be able to elevate it to something much, much higher.
Would you say inspiration is fire? To be inspired?
Yeah. When we talk about the loving experience, there is, apart from the passion of love, there could be an aspect of love that produces serenity, equanimity, spiritual touch. Have you ever experienced a state of absolute love where no words need be said? It's only a state of almost absolute stillness. It's like being in the eye of the storm. It's like finally achieving that absolute perfect stillness in the totality of the fervor that surrounds it, which becomes fire. These are the things also that are part and parcel. That would be a water-based focus in meditation to achieve that a particular manifestation of the state of love as such. I'm only raising these things, not so much that we're instructing how to do it, but at least that we can walk away from the session knowing that this exists, that there is an analytical tool to understand emotions, to be able to understand how we can actually arouse those emotions in appropriate fashion, how we can train the state of emotions, especially love. And when we talk about the love between parent and child, or the familial love that we're talking about today, which do you think applies most, fire or water?
Water.
I'm getting a lot of votes for water. And the answer is water. Because when you ask yourself, I love my father, I love my mother, on one hand, I love my husband, I love my wife, I love my girlfriend, I love my boyfriend. Both are states of love, but one you will use the metaphor of fire more readily, and the other one you use the metaphor of water much more readily. Because there's an essential truth in the differential. So we're talking here today in terms of something which is fiery in its very, very nature. I'm sorry, we were talking here that's something which is very, very water in its very, very nature when we talk about familial love. And it's softer, and you don't have to go as far in to draw of it because it's already there. That's why it's more natural. You said instinctive to love a parent than to love a stranger and then fall in love and they stop being a stranger, of course, etc. Okay? So today we've skirted around some more issues in terms of the nature of love and in another dimension. What I want to cover next session is compassion. And what does compassion mean? Compassion is a very major out there in the spirit. It's denotes whether you are a spiritual person or not. Do you have compassion, or compassion being the arbiter of what that's all? But also next week, what I want to do is look at the archetypes in more detail. Who represents what and why? And is it just symbolic, or is it something very real? And we'll consider those aspects as well. Okay? Any thoughts or questions? Now you can raise anything under the sun. Doesn't have to relate to what we spoke about.
In relation to elements of water and fire, I heard someone say recently that Israel is compared to fire and going water. What can you say?
Non-Jews relate to water and Jewish people to fire. No, I haven't heard that. I'm just trying to think why that might be the case. No, I'm not sure that I can actually say anything about that, because I don't really think that that's necessarily the case at all. I think it's human qualities, the four elements, fire, air, earth and water. Each of the 71 soul systems will channel those four in their own spiritual format, but they'll always come out as common denominators. In other words, when as I'm anticipating next week, a non-Jewish person expressing compassion is equally powerful as a Jewish person expressing compassion, etc. So that's not where the differential between different soul systems lies, and vice versa. On the contrary, I mean, I know of non-Jewish people who are far more compassionate than the Jewish people that I may know, etc. So I'm not sure that we can actually talk in those terms. It's a qualitative different thing. It's like if I were to put on glasses, and I put on glasses which have a blue tint, and I put on glasses which have a pink tint, and I'm looking at the world, I see the same world, but one is with a pink tint, and under those circumstances, all you're doing is just looking at the same. An analogy I'm using. That's what the 71 soul systems do. They all buy glasses from different glass shops. Okay? Basically. Yes?
I'm just wondering, you spoke about self-sacrificing type of love, familial love, and you gave examples of what if you wanted to go to your Collingwood match, you had a hard day and you had to give of yourself. What about if you don't look after yourself? You really got nothing else to give. There's
absolutely. Absolutely.
Living a life of just sacrifice.
Sure. A person can be, as I'll be saying maybe next week, you can be so compassionate that you give all your assets away and you're left begging in the street because you haven't got anything to support yourself. So obviously there's got to be what we call limits in terms of where mind is able to shape your feelings so it's intelligent emotions. Now there's a variation, because what might be correct for you as an act of intelligent emotion in the act of tzedakah, of sharing, might be quite different what's appropriate for me. In other words, with my inherited sets of genes and environmental influences and parents and all the other factors that make up who is me, I have a different test in life than you have, because you have your set of fixtures, etc. And therefore my test of tzedakah might be a pass rate, a pass mark here, and yours might be here or here compared to mine. So it's individual test, no comparison, but it goes that be intelligent about the emotion. And if you don't allow yourself at least the capacity of possessing the self-esteem of survival, the self-esteem that Hashem placed you in this world, because Hashem wants you as the most essential element, and if you act in a way which is careless about the giftedness, then you're denying the very gift that you were given. So that's where the inanili mili comes into it. If I'm not for myself, who am I? As
just to throw a spanner in the works
Yes, Cheryl.
a little bit, if I could. Sometimes familial love isn't intuitive. So how does that fit in?
Yeah, a person can be so hurt, for example, by a parent, whether that hurt be a physical assault or that hurt be just non-demonstration of emotion and all various degrees, etc., that the person, therefore, their natural chesed is so subdued that requires therapeutic mechanisms, training mechanisms, to be able to reawaken it. And that's very, very correct. That's very true. That doesn't deny its existence. We say it's human nature to have chesed, gevura, tiferes, netzah, hod, yesod, malchus. That's what's the nature of a human being emotionally, etc. And one of the things that we need to do with a person who can't express love, for parents, for example, because the parents have been so hurtful, and therefore they've lost trust in people as a whole, or lost trust in a generation, or lost trust in world, etc., is to try to create that reaffirmation of what is most natural within them. Why Hashem placed them in such a circumstance, that's got to do with the Gilgul HaNefesh, with the cycle of the soul. That's that person's test in life, God forbid. So you raise a real point, and that's where what we in West call therapy, and we might call training, comes into the picture.
I'm not really familiar with the 71 soul systems. Can you give us...
You mean you haven't sort of gone through and counted them all and met them all and did a sociological survey on them? Neither have I. I haven't got the faintest idea. I really don't. You see, whereas at the beginning, when this Torah was given, the 71 were identifiable in some shape or form, the Torah itself, although it tells us there are 71, only is a manual for one kind of this. Is the Torah is a Jewish manual, so it doesn't begin to provide indices and descriptions and purposes and manuals and pathways for the other 70. It's a manual for the Jewish one. So I don't have any clarity. Now the other problem, of course, is how many of the other 70 in fact still exist as an innate group, cohesive as such. I suspect not. How many cultures in the world have been so pedantically concerned with maintaining definition and identity as Jewish people have? It's very, very hard to find. And I'm not talking here about religious groupings either when I talk about the 71. Christianity, for example, is a daughter religion of Judaism. Islam is a daughter religion of Judaism. These are outgrowths from one of the 71 adopted elsewhere, etc. But were they necessarily one cohesive group? No, they were not. But I can't answer that. I don't know. It's just curious that there are 71. How many elements are there currently on the what's-the-name table? Periodic table. Where are they up to these days? I don't know. When I was at school, they were up to 102, 103. I think there's probably many, many more now. But I could ask the same question. I could ask, well, why, say we get to 102. Why 102? Why not 150? Why not 20? Because that's the way God created the world. Why 71? Send a letter to the editor. I haven't got the faintest idea. Why do we have 3 dimensions of existence, which we call in our tradition Mokim, space, Shana, time, Nefesh, consciousness. They're the 3 dimensions of existence. And there aren't any other dimensions of existence. One has got to do with the nature of space, the other one's got the idea of the flow of time, the other one is the nature of consciousness. There's nothing else in existence but those three. Everything that you can conceive of will have to have those three elements. That's the nature of the building blocks of this life. That's the way that the Creator decided to build this cosmos.
Nefesh is mind, yes?